Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Bennington Perry with the Circle of Atonement, and I'm here with Circle founder Robert Perry. And today we are talking about what is the soul. The topic of the soul is an interesting one, regardless of your spiritual path, but it's an especially lively discussion among course students. For one, there really isn't a consensus or a common understanding about how the course defines soul. And also, most references to the word soul have been edited out of some versions of the course. And so there's a lot of questions and theories regarding why that is. Robert and I hope to clear up some of this in our conversation today. We'll be talking about the definition of the word soul, what the course means when it uses that term, how soul appears in the course and in the lives of Helen Schuckman and Bill Thetford, why Jesus appears to have an issue with the term, why it's called controversial in the course, and what all of this means for our own practice. So, Robert, let's begin with the definition of soul, both how it's conventionally used and how it's used in the course.
I think we do have, just as English speakers, a sense of the word. I looked up a definition from the Encyclopedia Britannica. It says, in religion and philosophy, it's the immaterial aspect or essence of a human being, that which confers individuality and humanity. In theology, the soul is further defined as that part of the individual which partakes of divinity and often is considered to survive the death of the body. And I would add to this, like, we have a sense that the soul is this individual spiritual element that's kind of the seat of our existence, the seat of our ultimate reality. And we have a sense, meaning popularly, not in the course, but popularly, a sense that the soul is like on a journey. It travels into the body at birth. It exits the body at death. It goes into an afterlife state. Maybe it, reincarnates in other bodies. Maybe it's sort of progressing and aiming for an ultimate reunion with God. But I think
It can fall.
it can fall. Right. It can become corrupted and sinful and be damned. So I think that's all part of our cultural inheritance regarding this word.
Right, so the course has a few different ways of using the word soul depending on the context, and it differs from how we conventionally use the word soul in some ways. So let's talk about how the course uses the word soul.
There are a number of different senses to the word. One is, especially very early in the course, it's kind of just a way of referring to a person. Like, there's a quote that says, the miracle is the maximal service one soul can render another. You could just say one person there. There's a number of references to soul in terms of popular usage. Like, one quote says, they are perceived as willing to sell him, the devil, their souls. There's also references to soul quotes from the Bible. One quote in the course says, the ego is trying to teach you how to gain the whole world and lose your soul. But the vast majority of references to soul in the course's dictation is references to the soul as our true nature. So as our true nature, it's already fully created, doesn't need to develop or progress. It's already perfect. It never leaves the side of God, never departs from God. It's changeless. It's a co-creator with God, meaning it creates in heaven, creates spirit. It doesn't require correction, doesn't need to be taught, doesn't need healing. It lives in a state of knowledge, not perception. And those are really our technical terms in the course. It lives in peace and joy, and it's radiant and sheds its light everywhere.
So, from the qualities that you've just shared, this really interesting portrait of the soul emerges. And just to reiterate this idea of how the course defines soul, I think it would be helpful for us to go through some of the highlights of that picture of the soul one by one. starting with the idea that the soul is already fully created and changeless. So let's talk about that idea.
Yeah, it's interesting how many times he says it's been fully created, as if it wasn't partly created and then it has to go through a further process of fulfilling its potential, for instance. So it's fully created, it's already perfect, it never changes. So it's not in some kind of process. It's the finished product from the very, very start.
So this idea that the soul doesn't need to develop, it doesn't need to be taught is so interesting because that isn't the conventional association that we have with this term. You know, it's a commonly held view of the soul that souls continue lifetime to lifetime. They're learning lessons as we go. But again, that isn't the course's view. In
Yeah.
addition to,
Can I just
yeah, go
insert
ahead.
myself here? Sorry. Um, while we were talking, I just realized there's this lovely quote that's really kind of evocative. It says the course says it never leaves the sight of God. And if you think about that, that in just a few words undercuts the usual notion of the soul traveling, right? We really pictured the soul traveling into the body, out of the body, from one body to another, into the afterlife, back to God. And if it never leaves the side of God, it doesn't travel.
Mm, that's an interesting thought.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it actually reminds me of another thread that we could go down, which is how much of the soul is universal. You know, the Course says the sonship is your soul, and
Mm-hmm.
how much of the soul is personal to us. Um, so I feel like the Course does kind of try and play it both ways.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about that too.
Yeah. Well, most of the references to the word soul in the course talk about it as something individual to us. And often soul is in the plural, souls. However, the course, the course's overall teaching is that we all share the same capital S self. And towards the end of the references to soul in the text, there is a really enigmatic reference that I find very meaningful that you just mentioned that says the sonship, the entire sonship is your soul. And then it goes on to say that if you hate a brother, you're hating a part of your own soul. So their soul is definitely used in a collective sense rather than an individual sense where I have my soul and you have your soul.
It feels really similar to the sonship in that way. So if you say capital S sonship, that's all of us. And then if you say, you know, like lowercase s self, that's the individual self. And soul feels like something similar. So you have your capital S soul, that's the soul, the whole sonship that we share. And then you've got something that's personal to you that can be your soul.
Yeah, I think the best term in the course for capturing that distinction is son. So there is the one son of God. And then the course says that there's literally an infinite number of sons of God. So soul kind of has that same distinction where at the top level of soul, there's one soul and we're all parts of it. And then on another level of soul, we each have our own soul.
So, in addition to describing the soul as our true nature, the Course also describes the soul as being imprisoned. And this is a really interesting double-sided thing here in the Course because it mentions the soul, despite its perfect purity, as being starved. It says that the soul is lonely, that the soul needs to find rest and peace, the soul needs to remember its creator, and so on. And we get a preview of this idea before the Course even starts coming through in Helen's very first inner vision, which we call the priestess in chains. So let's talk about her. the priestess in chains and what that has to teach us about how the Course views soul.
Yeah, that Helen never attached to this the word soul, but in terms of what you just talked about, the soul being imprisoned, starved, in chains, etc., this fits that to a T. Because in her very first inner vision, and she kept having this over quite a period of time after she and Bill had their joining in a better way. There must be a better way or another way. So she in this inner vision, she sees this figure, and there's a sense of it being an ancient figure, heavily draped, kneeling with bowed head and with heavy chains, wrapped around her. And then over the time in which she kept having this inner vision, the chains began to drop away. The figure began to raise her head. She then finally stood up with just a little bit of chain attached to one of her wrists. And then Helen, she hadn't lifted her face yet. And Helen describes her as a priestess. So she hadn't lifted her face yet. And Helen was afraid of how she would look at Helen. Helen was afraid that she would see Helen with disapproval and judgment. And what Helen says is, when she finally looked at her straight in the face, she says, I burst into tears. Her face was gentle and full of compassion, and her eyes were beyond description. The best word I could find in describing her to Bill was innocent. So the ancient priestess has this, well, it has all these qualities of the soul in terms of the imprisoned soul, in that it's clearly pure and holy. The priestess is holy, yet is imprisoned, yet can be freed from prison by our choices. It was understood that the priestess was being freed by the choice that Helen had made to join with Bill.
And the priestess in chains is such an interesting story for all the reasons that you're describing, and this connection to the soul, because the priestess has both things that we've just been talking about. The priestess has that pure nature, but the priestess is also imprisoned. And the priestess is a reflection of Helen. The priestess has to rise, drop the chains, and then the story goes on to Helen having her function because the priestess is free. And so this whole idea of freeing the soul through our choices for God leading to our function is also really interesting.
It's like that priestess in her is kind of what's doing her function through her.
But the priestess can't, like Helen can't do her function unless the priestess is free. And if the priestess is like the stand-in for the soul, then Helen has to make the right choices to free the priestess so that she can go on to do her function, which is an amazing idea. And if you want to read more about the priestess in chains, there's a cameo in the back of the Complete and Annotated Edition of A Course in Miracles. I think it's cameo 31, Robert, is that right? Called The Priestess?
I think it is, yeah. I think so.
Okay, so that's Helen's story. Also, before the Course starts coming through, Bill has something similar. There's some overlap between Bill's story and Helen's priestess vision. That's truly interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So Bill made some kind of Freudian slip in conversation that's not worth going into, but Jesus references that Freudian slip from Bill in the notes, saying that Bill's slip was an expression of a soul gaining enough strength to request freedom from prison. It will ultimately demand it. So it feels like Bill's soul is having its own priestess breaking free from the chains moments. And do you want to say more about that?
Oh, it's just so fascinating, especially because it's so parallel, right? Bill has this holy element in him. It's in prison, but it's starting the process of getting free, but it's still in process, just like Helen's priestess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we really want to make clear these two elements of the soul as the Course describes it. It's the perfect, true nature of each of us that I guess can be synonymous with spirit. But then that pure spiritual element in us is imprisoned through the choices that we make for the ego and can be released from prison by the choices that we make for God.
Mm-hmm.
And would you say that that's a synopsis of what the Course has to say primarily on the topic of soul?
I would. There's more to it, but in terms of those two different things, I think we have to see them on two different levels, because the Course would say that our true nature as Christ is not imprisoned, but is totally awake, totally free, knows nothing of the ego and all that. And then there's this idea of some part of that true nature, which is like the Christ child in lesson 182, which I think we're going to get to. It's some element of that true nature that is not feeling free, but is feeling imprisoned and needs to return. So I think we have to see two different levels of soul.
So, this idea of the soul as being the pure element, pure spiritual element in us, but is imprisoned, we've talked about it in relation to an example from Helen's life, an example from Bill's life. And then, as you just mentioned, it also appears really strongly in the Course in Workbook Lesson 182. And in that sense, it can be applied to all of us. So, what does it say about this idea in Lesson 182?
Well, it's interesting because even though I count only about 10 references to the imprisoned soul in the early part of the text, this discussion in lesson 182, which is I will be still a moment and go home, goes on for paragraphs about this capital C child. Let me just read a couple of sentences here. And this is it's referring to a child within us, which is clearly the Christ child. Later references make that clear. So it's not like the adult awake Christ in heaven. It's the Christ child that somehow feels dragged down partway to earth. And here's what it says in one of the paragraphs. He desires to go home so deeply, so unceasingly, his voice cries unto you to let him rest a while. He does not ask for more than just a few instants of respite, just an interval in which he can return to breathe again the holy air that fills his Father's house. So he feels like pulled away from his Father's house, like breathing the choking fumes of this earth. And he's crying to us saying, will you just meditate on the hour for me so I can return for a little bit and breathe the holy air of my Father's house?
I think we can all relate to a longing that we have in us to find God. The Course also calls it the pull of God. We have a longing in us that there's something bigger and holier out there that we just are attracted to. We all have that call, and we call it the call of the soul, right? Like we can feel that within ourselves. And what I love about lesson 182 is that it puts language to it. It says, yes, that's real. And it's the Christ child is how the Course refers to it. But the way that it's described is like the Christ child is saying, like, could you just rest in God for a while so that I could go home? We know what that feels like. I think we all have that experience.
But we don't think of it like this lesson is framing it, as that longing is actually the voice of this soul within us saying, please let me go home. It's the longing for home. And it's also the sense that we don't fit here, that we're out of place, we're fish out of water.
Yeah, that's why I love that lesson so much, is because, again, we know what it's like to feel like an alien and to want to go home. But the lesson itself, and I would encourage anyone watching or listening to just go into lesson 182 and take a look at what it says. Beautiful, evocative language that when you read it, it's like, yeah, that's exactly what I want.
Mm-hmm.
So just getting back on track here, what's interesting is that it feels paradoxical. The soul doesn't need salvation because it was created perfect, but also the soul is imprisoned because of the ego-based choices that we're making. And so how can we thread the needle here? How can both of these things be true?
Yeah, I think the only way is that we see them on different levels. We see kind of like Christ and the Christ child. Like there's the adult Christ, awake in heaven, totally free, never bound in any way, never asleep. And then there's the child in that lesson that's still holy, that's still pure, but feels like pulled far from home, and needing to rise from chains and go back home. I think we have to see the soul on the same two levels, where there's the soul that's fully awake, fully free, and then there's some element of that top level soul that again is still pure but feels like it's far from home, needs to find rest, needs to no longer starve, needs to get free of prison. I think that's the only way to reconcile these different teachings. And again, the main usage of the word in the course far and away is that top level. But to be perfectly honest, I find that next level, the imprisoned soul, to be more interesting.
I think that part of that is because we feel that we feel that so deeply within us. I think we're all feeling that Christ child. And we
Like
call it the
calling.
pull of the heart, the pull of the soul. Like we know what it's like to feel like an alien here. And so we connect with that idea that yes, something holy is in me and it's imprisoned. But I think the connection we don't quite make is it's imprisoned because of the choices that we're making
Yeah.
to keep it there through our unforgiveness and our ego.
And as
So,
we just to add on one thing to that, as we set it free, a spiritual power and presence arises in us and works through us to do our function. And not only was that intimated with Helen's priestess vision, but in the text, there's this image of the infancy of salvation, which is like the infant Christ. And he's growing up within your holy relationship. And one day he'll stride through you to do miracles in the world.
well, that's what's so interesting about the story around Bill. His soul will ultimately demand freedom because of the choices. Like Bill's soul is getting stronger because of the choices that he's making for God. He's
Mm-hmm.
growing spiritually, and so his soul will demand freedom. Like
Yeah.
there's something like the more choices we make in the direction of holiness and the direction of God, something in us grows stronger. And it's like we also know what it feels like to have that part of us want to burst out.
Yeah.
Um, so really fascinating that it's right there in the lives of Helen and Bill. And
It's like
that,
I was just
go
going to say,
ahead.
it's like there's a giant that is ready to break out of chains if we let it.
Right. And so many people, this is a little bit of an aside because it relates to function, but so many people are like, how do I know what my function is? How do I fulfill my function? Well, start making choices for God and your soul will demand that
Mm.
freedom, and then you're a better vehicle to be worked through to achieve that function that you have in the world.
That's good. I'm going to use that in the future.
Let's get into the editing of the course. This is where I think it gets pretty juicy in relation to where the conversation in the course community is. So the word soul appears 163 times in the original dictation in Helen's notes, mostly clustered in the very, very beginning of the text. But even after the term stops being used, the concept of soul keeps returning, but without the word soul. And in the clarification of terms, the course says, quote, the term soul is not used extensively because of its highly controversial nature. So, what is highly controversial about the word soul?
You've just said a bunch of things that are all super relevant. And I feel like I'd like to back up and go through them one by one, because each one of those things you mentioned is really relevant to the whole editing of soul. So I'd like to just kind of crawl through them
Yeah,
slowly.
there is a lot there. Like,
Yeah.
why is it so clustered in the beginning? Why does he keep returning to it without using the word soul? And why does he call it controversial? That was a heavy question. Sorry to pack all
Yeah,
that in.
that's okay. That's okay. So all those things you said are ways in which Jesus indicates very clearly that he has an issue with the term soul. And so let's first talk about the fact that all the references to soul occur early on, and then it fizzles out as a course term. So in chapter 1, there was 33. Chapter 2, there's 17. We reach a high point in chapter 4 of 52, but then it sinks down to 13 in chapter 5. And after chapter 5, in 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, it's never more than 0 to 7 references per chapter. So from chapters 1 to 5, there's 13 to 52 references per. From chapters 6 to 12, there's 0 to 7, mostly like 1 per. And then after chapter 12, there is not a single other reference in the course. He makes a decision to decisively veer away from that term. Okay. So that's one indication that he doesn't retain it as a permanent part of the course's system.
By the way, does the word soul appear at all in the workbook?
No. Or the manual.
Like
So
just in the clarification of terms when it says why it doesn't use the word soul?
exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So just to make it super simple, I think there's like 145 references in the first 5 chapters. After that, there's like 17 more in the next 7 chapters, and after that, there's 0. So
Hmm.
it's very early, and then it just trickles and vanishes, and that suggests that Jesus had an issue. Basically, there's a macro pattern in the course where when he starts using a term, it's rough, it's more used conventionally, and then he kind of hits his stride with the term. And this happens with many terms. And he hits his stride, and then it settles into a permanent pattern of usage. And this is true with Holy Spirit, with projection, with make versus create, but
Ego.
with ego, exactly. I mean, we could multiply this. But with soul, the permanent pattern it settles into is to not use it.
But he does, as we're getting into, it's not like he abandons the idea of soul. He continues to reference the concept. He just doesn't use the word.
Well,
So how,
that's my next point I want to, sorry. What are you going to say?
well, I know, I was just trying to like give you a
Tee
smooth
me up.
segue. So how does he use the concept without using the word as you continue through the text?
Yes, this is exactly what happens. And this also shows that he has an issue with the term, because he not only uses the idea of our ultimate true nature, which he generally calls spirit, um, but he uses the very special notion of the imprisoned soul. Again and again, I've got about 5 occurrences, some of them quite lengthy. He talks about the other part in chapter 21, the other self in chapter 21, the infant Christ in chapter 19, Christ rising from chains in chapter 30, and then of course there's the Christ child in lesson 182. All of these are references to what you could call the imprisoned soul. They're perfect reproductions of it, but he just won't call it the soul. He calls it these different things all over the place. It's like he's just refusing to use that term, even when there's a very special concept that fits the term.
He does seem to kind of bend over backwards to not use the word soul after chapter 12.
Yeah,
Can I take you on just a tiny little aside? Because as
sure.
I'm looking at this list of the soul as the Christ child in us, the thing in us that demands its freedom, ultimately, it implies that our soul, while we think of it as being individual to us, has its own consciousness. It's doing its own thing independent of the will that we have for it. So can you speak to the soul having its own consciousness?
Well, yeah, I think that has to be true. It has to be true because all those descriptions, like think of the priestess, think of Bill's soul, gaining enough strength to request freedom from prison. For something to gain enough strength to request freedom, that suggests a consciousness there. So, I mean, I think that this shouldn't surprise us. The course talks about our total being quite vast and having these different areas or regions in it, including an infinite region that is fully awake in God. So the idea that there is some part of us that has its own consciousness and yet is tethered to the rest of us, right? It's not free, not because of choices it made, but because of choices our mind made. That shouldn't really surprise us if you carry a picture of the mind being or our total being a vast thing.
So where do you want to go from here?
Okay, so the next thing, after we've established that he clearly has an issue with the term, we come to the reference in the clarification of terms. And this was taken down after Helen Schuckman and Ken Wapnick had edited out almost all of the references to soul. So keep that in mind. But what it says is the term soul is not used except in direct quotations. And if you look at what's left in the FIP edition, it's where soul is being referenced almost like quoted from popular usage or virtually quoted from the Bible. So direct quotations is not too far outside the ballpark because of its highly controversial nature. It would, however, be an equivalent of spirit, with the understanding that being of God, it is eternal and was never born. So now we get to the controversial thing and the question of why is it controversial?
Why? Yeah,
Yeah,
what is controversial about it? Because it's a strong word, controversial.
it is. And there's not, I think, as much mystery in what he means by that as we might think. Because this is the opening section of the clarification of terms. It follows, it was originally continuous with what's now the introduction. So now you'll see an introduction separated from section 1. In the dictation, this was all one. And he had just done a lengthy paragraph on controversial things. And what he basically says is that, well, I'll read the quote. Theological concepts, as such, are necessarily controversial since they depend on belief and can therefore be accepted or rejected. So he's kind of setting the table for this clarification of terms, and he has reservations about even doing this whole clarification of terms, because he's saying all terms are potentially controversial, and those who see controversy will find it. So he's seeing certain terms as controversial, especially theological terms, because in essence, they can pull you away from the practical application. They can pull you away from what he calls the universal experience that he's aiming for. Okay. So he's kind of ambivalent about even clarifying terms, but all of that is the immediate context for the comment about the soul. The soul is obviously a theological term, and he's thinking this term can incite a lot of controversy, pull us away from practical matters and away from the experience towards this course, which this course is aimed, as it says.
So that quote that you just read is really interesting. Theological concepts as such are necessarily controversial since they depend on belief and can therefore be accepted or rejected. So by his own definition, controversial means something that depends on belief and can therefore be accepted or rejected. So what he's saying is that soul is something that depends on belief, and you can say, I believe this about the soul, or I don't believe this about the soul, and then you get stuck in a metaphysical roundabout, and that takes you away from the practical application of what the course is trying to teach you.
Yeah. And that's very similar, of course, to the comments on reincarnation towards the end of the Manual for Teachers. He basically says we're not going to commit one way or the other on that. It's not essential for salvation. It can embroil you in controversy. I think he mentions controversy and theological considerations there. I'm not exactly sure of that, but the gist of it's the same. Like, this is a concept that's not essential to salvation, and it's not essential to the change of mind right now that salvation is all about. And it can just get you sidetracked.
Idea of getting stuck in the theological nature, like stuck in the metaphysics of a concept in the course, and having that pull you away from the practical application does feel like what's happening in the course community in relation to the word soul. Because if you go into Facebook groups, for example, and type in the word soul, which I think you and I both did in preparation for this podcast, you'll see, I saw one group that had 258 comments on what everybody thought in relation to what the soul is. And I have seen this topic in particular does tend to trip people up. And for all the time that we spend talking about, well, what does the Course say about the soul? On one hand, it's good to iron it all out, as we try to do in this podcast. But on the other hand, how are you applying this concept? Are you fighting over what the Course says about soul and what was edited, or are you out there rolling up your sleeves and being loving in the world? And so it just feels like, for everyone who's kind of arguing about soul in the Course, missing the point of what the ultimate lesson of the Course is.
It's interesting because, he says it's not used extensively because of its highly controversial nature. And people have suggested, well, Helen, that was Helen. That wasn't Jesus. That line can't be trusted. I don't know why they think that, beyond the fact that they don't really like the line. But what's interesting is, while people get seemingly pretty heated about this issue of the word soul, they're proving his point, right? And that's what you're saying, that he's saying, look, this is a term, this is an idea that can attract a lot of controversy and pull us away from the things that matter, just like the idea of reincarnation can. And so let's stay away from it. And people are like, no, that's wrong. And then proceed to bear out his concerns.
Get stuck in that roundabout.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So it's very fascinating.
It does feel like, by that definition, anything could be controversial. There are people who are course students who don't believe in Jesus. And so, you could apply that definition to a lot of different terms in the course, but that's not the subject of this podcast.
That's true.
Getting back to...
That would be a conversation, because I have some thoughts about that, but it does seem like he's drawing an arbitrary line there, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, because there's so many other terms in the course that you could apply highly controversial to. Anyway,
think about when he says, sorry.
You can't help yourself, can you?
Think about when he says, do not make the pathetic error of clinging to the old rugged cross. Like, that's not controversial. Anyway, so we should march ahead.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so tempted to follow up on that, but I'm going to stay focused.
Okay.
Be focused, Emily.
One of us needs to.
I think that part of the reason why soul is viewed as controversial, apart from Jesus's definition of controversial, is because it's been so edited out of the course. And so as students, I think we feel like, well, why? What happened there? And so as we close, let's talk about how the soul was edited in the Foundation for Inner Peace version of A Course in Miracles, which was the original publication, and how the soul was edited in the Complete and Annotated Edition of A Course that we publish here at the Circle.
Okay. Well, of the original 163 references to soul that were in the notes, the Foundation for Inner Peace version retains just 11 instances, the one in the clarification of terms, of course, and then 10 other ones that all refer to like popular usage of the word or biblical usage of the word, kind of like that comment in the clarification of terms of it's just used in direct quotations. In the CE, we took a different tack. We kept 31 references to soul, and we did change, obviously, most of them. Some of the passages are not in the CE because, like the one about Bill was just about Bill, like that doesn't belong in the course proper. But most of the 163, references are in passages that did go into the CE. We changed most of them. And the obvious reason we changed them is there were those three ways in which Jesus indicated his reservations. He stopped using it pretty early on. He used the concept, but almost went to lengths to refer to it by a variety of other names, suggesting he didn't want to use the name. And then there's that very direct comment in the clarification of terms. And I don't think it's really fair to say, well, that was Helen. We can do that with anything in the course, right? Anything we don't like, we can just say, well, that wasn't Jesus, that was Helen. How do I know? Because I don't like what he says there. So what we did was we tried to respect that. He clearly prefers spirit to soul. And so we changed those references to soul that could be easily replaced without changing the meaning, mostly to spirit and son. Okay, son works really well because son is often individual in the course, like you're a son. There are sons of God. However, I mean, personally, I love the word soul and I didn't want to change any of them, but where it would change the meaning, there was no good substitute. It felt really fair to keep the word soul. So where it would change the meaning to change the word, we didn't change it, we kept it. And I just want to emphasize a few things about this. One is that, as we said earlier, this is common with terminology in the course. When a term's coming in, it can take a while to settle into its eventual form. Where soul settled was to not be there, to just be spirit, right? With make and create, that didn't come, he didn't make that distinction between make and create until chapter 3. We did go back and change earlier references to be consistent. Projection versus extension. Originally, he used the word projection for both. And so we had to figure out, do we change some of the earlier ones and say extension? So this is a common thing in the course where terminology starts out rougher and more conventional and then settles in finally to its course, its permanent course form. And again, the permanent form here was no usage of soul. What I mostly want to say is, even though I personally love the word soul, I do think the controversy is completely unnecessary because I don't think any meaning got lost. The fact is that a lot of students are concerned because soul suggests an individual seat of your spiritual identity. And that's there in the course. The course just wants to play it both ways. It will say you are a son, a child of God, a mind, a brother, and a part, an aspect, a creation. All those things have plural forms: creations, parts, aspects, sons, minds, all being God created, all before the separation occurred. The Course has us with an ultimate kind of individuality. It also straddles the fence where we are all completely one. We share one capital S self, and we all have our own part of that. And so I think what people are wanting from the word soul is, it says, you have your soul and I have my soul. And the Course says that, just in different terms, terms that stay throughout the whole Course. So you are a son of God, I'm another son of God, and we're both part of the Son of God. So I really think that nothing got lost. I personally feel that even though I love the word soul and it ached in me to change those, I personally think it's a tempest in a teapot, and I think it's an example of our tendency to get into controversy at the expense of the message.
Just kind of going back to the editing of the FIP, there are 11 instances of soul remaining out of what, 163?
Yeah.
All referring to popular concepts or biblical references. We're talking about the Foundation for Inner Peace version of the Course. So 11 out of 163. Do you think that that is because Helen, I know this is speculation, but do you think that's because Helen had a problem with the word soul? And we know from Helen's editing that she would pull things out that she had a personal problem with, like the sex material, for example. Or do you think that she felt like she was following Jesus's guidance to move on from that term?
I don't know, but I can say that there's no evidence that she had a problem with it, because if she had, it would have been getting removed and removed and removed all along the way. So as they did each editing pass, as the notes became the ur text became the second draft became the healing case became the FIP. If she had a problem with it, we would know. We'd be seeing her pull it out in drips all along the way. And I'm pretty sure nothing like that happened. I'm pretty sure all the soul references were there in the penultimate version, which was the Hugh and Casey version. And it's only after the Hugh and Casey version and in the editing of the FIP edition that they all get removed.
Why?
We don't know. One explanation, when things like that happen, I tend to think it was Ken Wapnick. In this case, though, I think that, the author clearly had an issue with the term. So if, for instance, let me give you a for instance here. The word will, which is a really important Course term, got removed in scores, in droves, in that final editing pass that Ken Wapnick was part of. I'm sure that was his influence. We put them all back in, every single one of them. We would have put all the souls back in, except for the fact that Jesus expressly says, it's not used except in direct quotations. He stopped using it. He refused to use it when he referenced the concept. There's a pattern there. And that pattern is too clear and loud. It was too clear and loud for us to ignore.
Okay. So just to be clear, because there's some students have an impression of the Complete and Annotated Edition that it was just arbitrary editorial choices that were made either because you wanted it to be made or someone here at the Circle wanted these editorial choices to be made in the CE. And what you're saying is that, yes, the majority of the references to the word soul were removed or changed
Replaced
to a word that was synonymous, like spirit. There are 31 of them that are kept in the CE. There are 11 that are kept in the Foundation for Inner Peace version of the Course. And the reason why in the CE that the word soul was either removed or replaced is because he bends over backwards to not use the term. He stops using it after chapter 12, and he calls it highly controversial. So for any student, the reason why I'm trying to be clear in
Yeah.
this list is because for any student who's wondering, like, why were the references to soul changed or removed or replaced? That's it.
Yeah,
So
but
just
let me
wanted
just
to be crystal
clarify.
clear on that.
It's
Okay.
not that he calls it highly controversial. It's that he says it's not used except basically rarely. The highly controversial justifies that. The key point is he talks about the usage of it being limited. And basically he indicates a preference for the term spirit. That's huge. And yeah, we can say, well, that was just Helen, but on what basis do we say that? I mean, we say about anything in the course that we don't agree with.
And also, I know we got to close here because we're at the top of the hour, but I like what you said a minute ago about he has preferred terms. So he prefers son and sonship to soul. And spirit is another one.
And I also think I haven't said this yet, but I think there's just an in-betweenness to the word soul that does not really suit him. Like spirit, you think of as top level. Soul, you think of as this individual divine spark running around in time and space, hopping into bodies, leaving them at death, hopping into another body, going through a process, returning home eventually. That whole the idea that you're some kind of spiritual entity that's separate, that's individual, that's running around, traveling through bodies. I just don't think that suits his purposes, even though, he did use the term early on, but I think that's why he eventually drops it.
Mm-hmm. He has his own preferred language that
Yeah.
he slides into and keeps for the remainder of the course.
Right. Right.
Okay. All right. Well, as we close here, let's just do what we always do, put it together in the big picture for anyone watching or listening. What does soul mean to our lives and to our everyday practice of the course? Why should we care about this topic at all?
In pondering that, I think the big picture is something we haven't really mentioned yet. And that
You know, you're
is
never supposed to give new information in the closing.
at the very closing, I know. The big picture is something he refers to again and again. He's always talking about the relationship between the mind and the soul. And the idea is the mind needs to associate itself with the soul. So it needs to identify with the soul, not the body. It needs to, or I'll say our mind needs to identify itself with the soul, not the body. We need to speak from the soul, not the ego. We need to value our soul more than anything else. We need to reach beyond our mind's distortions and return to our soul. So I think stepping aside from some of these more theological issues, we just need to think my mind needs to align itself with the soul, identify with the soul, speak from the soul, return to the soul. And then I want to add on to that a note of the imprisoned soul. We need to realize that when we do that, there is a holy priestess in us that is set free. There's a holy child in us that is finally rising from chains after eons of yearning to be free. And that last bit, I really love.
Mm. And when we make that pure spirit, that pure soul part of us free, so much becomes free to work through us in the healing of the world. But as long as it's imprisoned, then we're limited in our own spiritual development and limited in how we can be used in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a rich topic. And I would love to spend more time. We don't have it on the whole imprisoned soul idea and the priestess and all of that. But it
We should
ends
do
up
another
being a big
podcast
topic.
on the priestess. I don't think we've done that yet, but that would be a really good topic to
That
have
would
a
be great.
podcast on.
Yeah.
Robert, thank you. As always, thank you to those of you who've joined us live as well. We appreciate it. And if you're listening and would like to join us for a future broadcast of Exploring A Course in Miracles, just go to circleofa.org/events and you'll find the link there. These are free, and we record every Thursday from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern. On behalf of all of us at The Circle, thank you so much for watching or listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.